Okay, thank you everyone. It is 2:15, so we will start. I know there are a couple of people missing, but I'm not obviously entirely sure whether they're coming back. So we'll make a start and hopefully they'll catch up. Before we move on to safeguarded land, has the council had the chance to look at the anomalies issue?
We have had a brief look at that, but I think it would be helpful if we could have a bit of time to come back to you properly on the matter.
Okay, so the general question there is about how sites with planning permission have been treated. Sort of generally, there was an example given at Mortham Abbey, and then your own response in relation to the Ivy Chimneys road site. Okay, thank you. In that case, we'll move on to the last question concerning Greenbelt before we move on to flood risk, issue 5, which is whether it is necessary for safeguarded land to be identified, having particular regards to the requirement for plans to be reviewed within 5 years of adoption. So I start with the council and then we'll take points around the room. Thank you.
For my sins, it's me. Good afternoon. The council's position on this matter is set out in our hearing statement for matter 4 at paragraphs 63 to 67. That will be on pages 22 to 23, and for reasons set out in those paragraphs, we say that it cannot reasonably be considered necessary to identify in this local plan areas of safeguarded land within the Greenbelt. Most unusually, under these transitional arrangements, the soundness of the local plan submission version is being examined against what might be described as obsolete government policy. And in the particular circumstances that we are currently in, it would not be reasonable to identify safeguarded land in the plan. I'm content to summarise the reasons that are in our hearing statement, if you'd like me to, but very good. First of all, safeguarding is not a requirement for every local authority with Greenbelt land and may not be necessary depending upon a range of factors. The Council does not consider it necessary at this stage, which I've just said, and has decided not to specifically include provision for safeguarded land. And having regard to those changes in National Greenbelt policy within Chapter 13 of the now revised framework, I think it's a 2019 framework, in particular paragraphs 135 to 139, it will be wholly inappropriate to identify areas of safeguarded land within the existing Greenbelt areas in the district. Relevant to our consideration, of course, is the requirements of paragraph 33 of the 2019 framework and regulation 10A of the 2012 regulations, requiring us to complete a review of this local plan within 5 years of its adoption. And given the changes to national policy, including the changes to Greenbelt policy that I've mentioned, and those relating to housing supply and delivery, at this stage it's impossible to know whether the exceptional circumstances necessary to alter existing Greenbelt boundaries will exist in the future. And in those circumstances, addressing the issue as it was mentioned in your MIQ, articulated in your MIQs, ma'am, the potential for an increased level of housing need in the district to be identified in the plan is but one of many material considerations that will be relevant to any future review of this plan, and of itself, that potential for an increased level of housing need cannot rationally be considered a proper reason to identify in this plan areas of safeguarded land in our district. To do so would be to ignore, we say, other material planning considerations, not least the potential for the development needed to meet any future increased housing need to be delivered in areas beyond the Greenbelt outside the district. I would add, obviously, that will be the subject of ongoing duty to cooperate discussions and work between this authority and its housing market area partners.
Sorry. Thank you, Mum. Yeah, our view is that it is necessary for the council to be identifying safeguarded land at this point. At the moment, we draw reference to paragraph 85 MPPF in terms of needing to look at requirements well beyond the end of the plan period, and then also in particular having regard to paragraph 83 in terms of a need to have regard to the intended permanence of green belt boundaries in the long term. Of course, that is the purpose of green belt. It is an intention, but it is to be a permanent sort of long-term boundary to provide certainty in terms of development. And we say that the council's approach is I think it's inconceivable to say that the council will not need to identify further releases of the green belt as part of any review of the green belt. We're all well aware of the standard method figure, which is due to come in. I think that proposes an uplift at the moment of in the region. I think it's a 78% uplift on the council's current OAN figure. Of course, I think the council would say there's probably some uncertainty in terms of how that figure is to be calculated, but the government have made very clear that, in effect, it's a matter of sort of public policy to meet its target of 300,000 dwellings per year. And it's worth noting that based on the current standard method calculations, the government isn't able to achieve that. So I think the 923 per annum figure on the standard method should be very much seen as a minimum. I think the difficulty as well is that there is obviously a need to review the plan within a legal requirement to review the plan within 5 years. The revised framework actually says at paragraph 33 that where local housing needs figures have changed significantly, that they're likely to require an earlier review. So I think I think in this particular instance, it's very clear that that would apply to the district. So we would certainly be advancing that there would be a need to have a review much earlier than 5 years. I think the other issue that the council face here. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. The issue here, I think, is just really about providing certainty to the local community and to developers in respect of the future need to release land. And basically, if we were to proceed with no safeguarded land at this point in time, then all we would be resulting in is a need to then release further land potentially within a couple of years, which is not likely to provide that certainty and align with the requirement to have regard to the intended permanence of the greenbelt boundaries.
Thank you. Mr. Dawkins.
Thank you, ma'am. I think Mr. Bell has covered many of the points that I wanted to make as well. I think in simple terms, there's just a few points. Obviously, the framework that we're assessing this plan under permits safeguarded land to be considered, paragraph 85, as we've heard. The new framework, which the council have referred to, says in paragraph 139D, makes clear that local planning authorities need to demonstrate that greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the plan period. Third point, stage 2 greenbelt review, paragraph 5.16 to 17, the consultants clearly recommend that the council consider safeguarded land. And I think reading the council statement, paragraph 63 on the examination statement, that to me is the first time the council have seriously considered whether or not there ought to be safeguarded land. And the second thing that comes out of that is that if you read paragraph 63 to 67, it just reads as uncertainty. There's uncertainty, you know, and I think if there's uncertainty, you need to think ahead in the context of what's in the framework. And I don't think the council have demonstrated that greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the plan period. And therefore, I think the issue of safeguarded land ought to be considered and included in the plan.
Thank you. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. So if we go back to the basic principle of paragraph 79 of the MPPF, the aim of Greenbelt is to keep land permanently open, and its essential characteristics are its permanence. And if we have a continual review process of the Greenbelt every 5 years, then that fundamental principle of Greenbelt is undermined. Paragraph 83 of the MPPF, of course, requires that you demonstrate exceptional circumstances for a review of the Greenbelt, and effectively a local plan, if it has to be reviewed every 5 years, will be the normal circumstances. What the council is suggesting is that rather than exceptional circumstances, it becomes the norm that you review the Greenbelt. Again, that would undermine the purposes, fundamental aim of Greenbelt. In relation to paragraph 85 and where necessary to safeguard land, that must be the case here. If you had a district which was partly Greenbelt and partly not Greenbelt, then there could be an argument that you don't need to safeguard land because you have other options. But inevitably, in a district which has got such significant Greenbelt coverage outside its urban areas, it's going to be necessary to review the Greenbelt to meet development needs. Of course, the third bullet point of paragraph 85 identifies meeting needs stretching well beyond the plan period. And the fifth bullet point, that local authorities need to be satisfied that the boundaries won't need to be altered at the end of the plan period. So that is 2033. The Greenbelt should not be being reviewed in 2033, let alone in 5 years' time. I think when you read well beyond the plan period in the third bullet with the fifth bullet, then you've got to be looking at into the 2040s before you should be thinking about reviewing the Greenbelt again. That's why this is such an important issue. I just wanted to touch on some of the things that the council said in opening. I suppose I was staggered actually at the first suggestion that the 2012 MPPF is obsolete policy. The council has rushed to get an application, a local plan in, so it can be tested under the 2012 MPPF, and now you're being told that policy is obsolete. That seems to me to be perverse. But of course, this part of the MPPF hasn't changed in the 2018 or 2019 MPPF, and it's long been part of Greenbelt policy back to PPG2, is that you must safeguard land so that the boundaries don't need to be altered again at the end of the plan period. If you just bear with me 1 second, I think I had something else that I wanted to cover. Yes, so of course what the MPPF says is that you need to release land in case it is needed. In case it is needed. So what the situation will be in the next local plan review would then decide that land is needed or whether it isn't needed for development at that point. So the council's position isn't council's local plan isn't undermined if you remove land now from the Greenbelt and safeguard it. If it proves not to be needed in the next review of the local plan, it just remains safeguarded into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Belton.
So I'll be very brief because Mr. Campbell has systematically picked off every one of my points. But the only additional point I would just make is that as well as this district being almost entirely covered by Greenbelt, we should also remember that a lot of the neighbouring authorities are also. So that heightens the prospect that we need some safeguarded land.
Thank you. Mr. Brent.
Likewise, Ma'am. Mr. Campbell has raised a number of the points. And really just to reiterate that point in terms of land should only be granted in safeguarding land should only be granted on an update to the plan. So actually, in terms of that 5-year review, you need to have that safeguarded land in order to have that review, to make that review effective. But also, I would like to stress the point that I don't think safeguarded land should be used as a mechanism for not allocating sites that are needed now. And I think it's important not to just focus on saying, actually, we'll just safeguard some sites, and those safeguarded sites are then there, and we can find the plan sound and move forward. You need to ensure that those sites are allocated now and identify and deliver against that need and make sure that there is a sustainable pattern of development, and actually those sites can come forward rapidly and meet that, especially in terms of the backlog we're finding here in Epping Forest. So I just want to make sure that we're not using safeguarding land incorrectly, and actually it is there to address needs that could come forward, but we're not aware of now, and only on review. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, ma'am. I agree with the comment of the Home Builders Federation in terms of the council are telling us that we have a plan that's unable to deliver a level trajectory for the first 10 years post-adoption, and it's unable to establish a 5-year housing land supply applying Sedgefield. So clearly any question of safeguarded land, by virtue of the council saying there aren't any small or medium scale sites available, can only be at a strategic scale. So I'd suggest that it doesn't actually help the fundamental issues of the plan. The second point is I actually disagree with my colleagues, and I think being a house builder, it's very easy to jump on the safeguarded bandwagon and almost say, well, actually, if it's a mission site, it's better to get it safeguarded than not at all. I think my view here is that you need to read the NPPF as a whole, and whilst it says what it says about the permanence of the greenbelt, it's also quite clear that the introduction of the standard method is a significant step change in policy and how housing need is calculated, and also the introduction of the 5-year review mechanism is also quite a significant change. And I think if you look at those together, I don't think it's realistic or pragmatic in this case to try to get this plan adopted with sufficient safeguarded land to meet housing need beyond the end of the plan period, given the significant step change between the OAN that the council is telling us we have today and the standard method. So I would concur with the colleague at the end of the table that I think it's more appropriate to introduce an early review of the plan in light of the significant change in housing need, rather than trying to pretend that we can safeguard sufficient land to somehow mean that we don't have to revisit greenbelt boundaries until 2040, which I just think is an unrealistic expectation based on the plan as currently drafted.
Thank you, Mr. Loon.
Thank you, ma'am. Just to reiterate what's been said about government objectives to build 300,000 homes per annum, NPPF requirement to boost significantly housing supply, and in that respect, I ask, has the plan been prepared positively or with caution? Is the council planning to the wire? And the question is, what happens if the council's strategy fails? So I would advocate there needs to be some flexibility in the plan, noting that there are some big releases which the council are proposing in its trajectory. Having safeguarding land will bring certainty. As Mr. Campbell said, we don't want to be back here, or we shouldn't be reviewing this plan until well into the 2040s when it comes to Greenbelt review. So we want certainty now for the plan period. And I think with safeguarded land there will be appropriate opportunities for sustainable development, which then could be released at the local plan review stage. An example of that is the North Weald Bassett master plan area, where the council is releasing that land for residential allocation. Within the master plan area, the council has identified a third phase which it's not allocating, and I question why the council is not allocating that. But the point is that they could, if they're not going to allocate it, and you don't agree to allocate it, that you could safeguard that land So at the appropriate time in the future, it could be considered for an allocation in the local plan review.
Thank you. Mr. Collins?
Thank you. Again, I don't want to repeat too many of the comments. I can't see the nameplate, but I think it was Mr. Bell set out the position in terms of numbers, and I have to agree with what Mr. Campbell was saying. I think the situation here is that Greenbelt is a very high-level policy, and you shouldn't be reviewing it every few years. Greenbelt boundaries have been in place for many years, and therefore safeguarded land is a way of analysing now, in effect, the next step, so you don't keep having to revisit Greenbelt. So to that extent, I agree with Mr. Campbell. Very shortly, I think you have to be cautious, however, because, as I know was said this morning, the methodology is not fine enough a grain, so you have to ensure that the safeguarded land is the land that doesn't meet the purposes of the Greenbelt. So that has to be done at the right level of detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bolton?
Thank you. I agree with much of what's been said around the table, and I do actually think this goes to the heart of the plan in some ways. What the plan states at the beginning is it had to get in quick, and it had to get in quick and wait for its evidence base to be published after it was submitted in order to secure, if you like, the lower housing number. And if it can do that, then it also isn't going to meet its OAN, and it's also not going to identify safeguarded land. Now, when you put all those things together, your first question is this plan actually being positively prepared? I don't think it is, to be blunt about it, and I think that's the big question here. Specifically when one looks at the advice in the framework 2012, which you're having to use, have the council demonstrated that the Greenbelt boundaries will endure beyond the end of the plan period? The answer is no, they haven't. They've produced no evidence whatsoever that the Greenbelt boundaries will endure. Everything, including the forward to the plan, suggests that they won't. So that comes to paragraph 35. Is it therefore necessary to look at safeguarded land? Well, because you haven't got the evidence that the boundaries will endure, I think it then becomes necessary. And what do we know? We know that in 5 years' time, there'll be another 5-year requirement to add on to the plan, unless you go down the let's shorten the plan period rabbit hole, which is more difficult under the new framework. So you know you've got another 5 years of development. At the present time, the best estimate you can have of that is the requirement for the standard method, which would 937. So it's 937 times 5 years, which gives you some 4,685 dwellings. At 35 dwellings per hectare, that gives you a requirement of about 134 hectares. Now, that might be too much, it might even be too little, but it's a good indication of where you might be. If it's too much, you don't have to release all your safeguarded land. But it seems to me that there is evidence available, and it also seems to me that the 2012 framework wasn't written on the basis that you will know everything that's going to happen before the review of the next plan. It clearly wasn't. 2012 was just as confusing as it is now in terms of where all the projections were going. So there was never the degree of certainty that the council is saying they need to have in order to do this work. It doesn't require that level of precision. So the council are wrong, I think, on that approach. Moving on, is if the council are saying we accept that we might need to review the Greenbelt boundary within possibly less than 5 years, because 5 years is a standard time to review a plan under the new framework. So when, as colleagues pointed out, when you've got a major difference in terms of your housing needs, you're going to do it more quickly. Do we put policy in this plan saying we've put no safeguarded land in, however we recognise that the Greenbelt boundaries will be reassessed in the short term? Now, that's effectively what the council are asking you to do or to accept. Now, whether or not a policy like that would pass the test of soundness is quite an interesting question, because effectively they're asking you to do that, but possibly they won't accept a policy on that on the grounds they know they'll get challenged. But it's a fundamental issue, I think, here. And therefore, I think, on balance, you are required to come to the conclusion whether or not there are any sites that could be identified as safeguarded land. And I'd say there are. There are the sites in the North Weald Master Plan that have been identified. And there are other sites which perform poorly or not as well in terms of the green belt. They could be taken out. They're not necessarily developed in 5, 10, 15 or even 20 years. But it can be done. But I come back to the point where I actually think this is just another example of demonstrating how negatively prepared this plan has been. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Hollingworth.
Thank you, Mum. Just 2 quick points, if I may. I mean, firstly, clearly there are sites which are currently suitable, available and achievable, which have been unjustifiably rejected, and I appreciate we'll be discussing those under matter 5 and the approach there. But as they are suitable, available, achievable now, and the council is suggesting that it can't meet their housing need, now, their current housing need, then clearly it would be illogical to safeguard, and be much more appropriate to simply allocate those sites. And secondly, just an observation. Yesterday we discussed employment needs and the council's approach there. And the council noted that they'd identified a need for between 16 and 19 hectares of employment land. And their approach to meeting that with sufficient flexibility, and I believe ensuring that they wouldn't have to amend the Greenbelt boundary again before the end of the plan period, was to then allocate 23 hectares of land, which is an uplift on the identified need of between 21 and 44%. And I just want to note the contrast there between the approach to employment land and the approach to housing, which, given the importance government places on meeting housing needs, and given the fact that there's clearly an acute shortage of housing in the district, seems, well, at the very least, counterintuitive. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just like the council to address a couple of points that have come up around the table, sort of similar points being raised. If you turn to paragraph 85 of the framework, Mr Campbell and others made the point that in an authority such as this, where there is some sort of emerging evidence that housing delivery is likely to need to carry on at a potentially higher level into the future, and it is a Greenbelt authority. I was just wondering if you could comment on when, if it's not necessary here in this authority and now, where it might be necessary to consider safeguarded land.
If this policy, national policy, was enduring in the form that it is, I would fully accept on behalf of the council that there would be it would be difficult to identify circumstances where it would not be necessary. But our answer to this issue can't be salami sliced, in the sense that we're refusing we're seeking certainty, first of all, or that we're refusing to consider the potential for the need for safeguarded land. But it's a very peculiar set of circumstances where this plan has been prepared, and we've taken against the 2012 framework over a number of years at a very, very significant cost in terms of public resources, for national policy to change so markedly, not just in respect of Greenbelt, and the observation I made in respect of national policy being obsolete is not in just one paragraph of national policy, but we pursued an appropriate option, and a valid option, to take advantage of the transitional arrangements, having carried out duty to cooperate work with our housing market area partners, one of whom had already, one of whose plans had already been through the process of examination and had been adopted. National planning policy now requires an approach to Greenbelt that is substantially different than the 2012 framework, and the need to consider, to take into account a number of new considerations when altering Greenbelt boundaries. Greenbelt policy in 2012 framework is from PPG2, back in the days when we had county structure plans, and following that regional planning. And in that respect, the shift towards to the duty to cooperate, then followed by the shift to national policy that changes Greenbelt policy, is those set of peculiar circumstances where it is not necessary in the circumstances that we're in to safeguard land now. The point being is that the plans within the house, the local plans that are being prepared, and the three of them that are being will be examined against the 2012 framework, must all be reviewed within 5 years. But it's not the simple type of review that participants have been discussing this afternoon. It's a review against a new policy framework, including a new approach to deciding when it is appropriate and what an authority must do before when considering alteration of Greenbelt boundaries. It is not correct to describe that our partner authorities are covered by Greenbelt in the way that we are. And in the next number of years, consideration will have to be made at a strategic level as to where, not just within this district, but within the housing market area, or whatever term we should be calling it in due course, where development needs should be met. Now, anybody who's speaking today about there being this plan not being positively prepared because it's not meeting housing need, well, first of all, we don't accept that. But I don't understand any of them to be asking you any of the participants to be asking you to delay allocating their site until after 2033. So we've got to be very careful here and make sure that we are having a discussion on a proper basis. We are considering whether it's necessary in 2019, having regard to the change in circumstances that was brought about at a late stage of preparing this plan, and referring to national policy. It is necessary, having regard to the requirement in national policy for this plan to be reviewed within 5 years against a new national policy. It is necessary to safeguard land, and the simple answer is that it is not, because the question as to whether they're sustainable patterns of development, whether the achievement of sustainable development could be achieved by doing so, is no. The simple answer to that is no, because we would be applying the long-term test the wrong long-term test in terms of national policy.
Thank you. And the other bullet point in paragraph 85 is it's been suggested that the council hasn't presented evidence to satisfy themselves that the Greenbelt boundary will not need to be altered at the end of the plan period. Could you address that point?
I think again, I think the answer is built upon the same answer. Is at this stage, it is not possible to come to a conclusion either way as to whether or not the Greenbelt boundary would need to be altered at the end of this plan period. It's relevant in that respect to a certain extent that we are well into this plan period, but until the discussions are had, the type of discussions that would not have been necessary under old-fashioned Greenbelt policy with housing market areas, we must ask the question of our duty to cooperate partners as to whether or not, including London, as to whether or not it will be necessary to accommodate development within the Greenbelt, so in other words, alter Greenbelt boundaries after 2033 in due course. So it is not possible to know either way whether or not it's necessary because of the specific circumstances, peculiar circumstances that we're in at this present time, and therefore it's a decision that is justified in the circumstances, and we would say consistent with national policy insofar as national policy has changed and we have this valid plan making option available to us to have this plan examined against 2012 framework, having regard to the fact that national policy is changing markedly in that respect that I've described.
Thank you. I'm going to take the boards that are up now, and then we're going to stop and move on to issue 5. So Mr. Bolton, Mr. Berent, and Mr. Collins, and then we're going to finish. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I don't think that the changes that are, if you like, detail how one goes about looking at the need or otherwise to provide safeguarded land have changed that significantly. I was trying to write down everything which was said, and it was a little bit difficult to follow, but it seemed to be something along the lines of we are going to have to meet the standard method, the dwelling requirement, or if we don't meet that, engage duty to cooperate. Don't actually think that's significantly different from identifying an OAN and engaging to the duty to cooperate, which is required under the 2012 framework. It's pretty much the same process. It's tightened up to make sure that it does, things don't fall off the edge. But the actual process seems very, very similar to me in that respect. And the idea of, well, we don't want to make any adjustments now in the hope that someone else is going to step forward and meet our housing needs, I don't think really meets the test.
Thank you. Mr. Collins.
Thank you. Firstly, I struggled to understand the answer, I have to say, because the way I understood it was almost if we wait long enough, notwithstanding the fact there's this new policy and new numbers, if we wait long enough, something might change in the future and we might never have to meet them. Now, I might have misunderstood that, but that's how I understood it. And I really just wanted to come back to something Mr. Bolton said, because he made a comment about that the council hadn't evidenced that they would need not to release Greenbelt. And I think it's the opposite. I think they've evidenced that they will have to release Greenbelt because they've gone as far as identifying, as far as I can work out, areas that are currently open space, for example, within settlements. They've kind of maxed out on their settlements. So it seems obvious that they're going to have to make releases. Therefore, it seems obvious that they ought to be safeguarding land so that they don't have to review Greenbelt boundaries in 2-3 years' time because they're failing to deliver adequate numbers. But as I say, I just struggled understanding what the answer was.
Thank you. Has this been said, has it? No, Ms. Barrett. Oh, you just...
I put it down.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Does the council want any final response to anything that's been said there?
I think I'd just like to come back on the point made about the fact the plan hasn't been positively prepared. It has, and it's been positively prepared with sufficient flexibility against the requirements of the MPPF 2012. And the other point I'd like to make is that we can't quantify the impacts of additional development without substantial additional work, because we would need to consider the considerable constraints in this district, which have been finely balanced in terms of the transport infrastructure constraints, as well as the impact on Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation.
Thank you. So we're going to end discussion there of issue 4. We have issue 5 left to discuss. I think there'll be a big departure, I think, now. So thank you to everybody who's contributed today. Should we have just a 10-minute break, if that's okay? 5 past, 10 past, perhaps. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Mark Beard, barrister, instructed by the council, to my right. is David Coleman, again from the council, and to his right is Mr. Tai Tsui, who I think is here for the first time.
Ed Norris, DLP Planning, on behalf of the Farmers Club Charitable Trust and the land interests at Waltham Abbey.
Thank you.
Tom Hill, Queen's Counsel, on behalf of Commercial Estates Group and Hallam Land.
Thank you. Ms Butcher. Sorry, Mr Butcher.
Hello, Andy Butcher, Stratton Parker, representing Countryside Properties, North Weald, Bassett.
Olivier Spencer from Andrew Martin Planning. We are the Miller Homes on the East of Harlow site.
Thank you. Thank you. This is issue 5. It's the distribution of development justified in respect of the approach to flood risk and to protecting water quality. And thank you for the, I've got document ED3, which was very helpful, the statement of common ground between the Environment Agency, Epping Forest, District Council and Thames Water. Does everybody sitting here have that to hand? Yeah. And also the council's statement, because in relation to the questions I asked, essentially the council has proposed a number of changes, having consulted with those other bodies, which largely address the questions I had and the concerns that I raised. So we will run through those, and then obviously if people have other concerns they wish to raise, then that's fine as well. So I really just wanted to start with a discussion of the modifications in this ED3 document and the council's matter 4 issue 5 statement. Now, it seems to me that the majority of the amendments in both of these documents taken together concerning flood risk rather than water quality for now, they seek to clarify that no built development on residential allocations will be permitted in flood zone 2 or 3, except for essential infrastructure and water compatible uses. As I said earlier, this would seem to address the concern of some participants that certain associated uses for open space etc., could be in higher risk zones. Is that the intention of the change? It is. Okay. Does anyone have any comments on those changes in principle? Or did they address any concerns that people had about the possibility that open space, etc., could take place within those zones? Ms Butcher.
Well, I'm not a concern about open space matters, and I'm pleased that Epping have been able to reach the statement of common ground. Not a problem at all. The questions you originally asked, I think, have been largely dealt with, and hopefully you will have seen my hearing statement, which deals with my site specifically in terms of in relation to flood risk. So I certainly don't want to go over those points. I suppose my main point with the suggested changes, and it's really a question perhaps for the council, is that the policy DM15 provides for a requirement for a site-specific flood risk assessment, which is fine. And indeed, I think the expectation is that all major sites would attract a requirement for a site-specific flood risk assessment. And then I suppose I'm just a little bit concerned that the subsequent changes that are set out on page 27 of the Council's Matter 4 hearing statement then repeat that requirement for each of the allocations. And it did seem to me that policy DM15 is a sort of overarching policy that deals with flood risk, and I did question the necessity then to repeat that requirement in respect of each of the policy allocations, bearing in mind that each of the policy allocations I would suggest would be a major development, which according to the planning practice guidance would attract a requirement for a site-specific flood risk assessment in any event. And of course there is an opportunity for the council to provide for these matters, just wearing my DM hat for a moment, as part of the validation checklist, which they will they will prepare from time to time and update. So it's simply a question as to whether it's necessary to repeat those requirements for each of the sites, given that there is that overarching requirement.
The council address that.
Thank you, Madam. There is a degree of overlap, but we think for the avoidance of doubt, given the importance of this issue and given the responses that we've received from the Environment Agency, it's prudent to ensure it's covered within the respective P policies as well as DM15.
Mr. Butcher, are you concerned that there's any conflict between the two? Is it the policy wording of DM15 as amended, as shown on 26, that you're concerned about, or the existing wording?
Sorry, Mum. As I say, my principal concern was that, as I say, you have the overarching policy in the local plan, which is DM15, which has now been, or is intended to be amended by the changes that are set out on page 26, which makes reference to site-specific flood risk assessments being required. And then the following pages repeat that requirement for each of the strategic allocations. My simple concern is whether it's absolutely necessary to do so if you have DM15 which overarches all of the strategic allocations in any event. It just seemed an unnecessary repetition, and that was the simple point that I was seeking to make.
Okay, thank you. The other changes that Mr. Butcher's referred to, it intends to introduce the same wording into each of the place policies. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
And the Environment Agency was obviously supportive of that approach.
Very much so, as reflected in the Statement of Common Ground. Yes.
Okay. Well, as we said, we'll run through the ones that don't match in a minute. But for now, I think if it's a question of repetition rather than a concern about any conflict, then I think perhaps safer to work for now, working up the modifications on that basis. If we just look at the modifications that aren't exactly the same, so we've talked about the DM15 on page 26, and then there's another at the top of page 27 to paragraph 4.99 of the plan. Essentially inserting wording relating to the SFRA site assessment. Anyone, any concerns about that? Yep. Thank you. They're all the same. Yep, and note as well that the change on page 28 of the council statement, P to P6 North Weald Bassett, is instead of the change shown in the Statement of Common Ground. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Right, yep. Okay, turning back to the Statement of Common Ground on page 4, a couple of similar changes along the same lines proposed to policy SP5. Any concerns? Mr. Hill, perhaps? No? Likewise, supporting text 2.130. Change is proposed, second from the bottom, to part A1 of DM5 concerning improving connectivity of habitats. Any concerns there? No? Nope. And DM17. Concerning the buffer adjacent to a watercourse. Any comments? Concerns? Okay, that covers all of the proposed modifications in relation to flood risk. Just one other question on flood risk before we leave that point. So in my MIQs, I asked about whether it was necessary for certain allocations with part of their land area in flood zone 2 or 3 to pass the sequential and exception tests. And I think the council's position there is that if the modifications we've discussed are made to require all built development to be within flood zone 1, then the sequential test will be passed and the exception test will not be required. So, do I understand that position correctly?
Thank you, Ma'am. If I can just clarify on the exception test point, the position from the Environment Agency is that the work, i.e. the flood risk SFRA site assessment, provided an initial assessment in terms of exception test, but the exception test itself cannot be passed until further site-specific flood risk assessment has been produced through the planning application process. But the EA is satisfied that the work included in the SFRA site assessment is policy compliant in terms of national policy. Thank you.
And presumably provides confidence that it could be passed.
Yes.
Mr. Norris.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise a quick point regarding the question 2 and the specific sites you've listed out there. Obviously, throughout the site selection process, any sites that have comprised of development within or proposed development within flood zones 2 or 3 have been automatically excluded. However, obviously, the sites that you've raised in your question 2 there, my client's site, without going into too much detail, is very similar to those sites in terms of there is a brook running through the centre of the site. The assessment of the site takes no account of the mitigation that has been proposed in both Reg 18 and 19 stages, and the master plan and site-specific FRA that have been submitted in that matter as well. So really, it goes back to the sustainability appraisal and how it's compliant with that when these sites can be allocated with very similar characteristics to my client's site, whereas a site with similar aspects doesn't get assessed in the same way.
Has yours been excluded for flood risk reasons? Is that what you're saying?
It's been excluded for Greenbelt, for Greenbelt harm, but I raised briefly in this morning's session that the site was excluded because the parcel assessment was much larger than the actual site comprised of. So it's just bear with me 2 seconds.
Sorry, I think the sort of main question I'm asking is, are you saying that it's been sifted out for sequential test reasons incorrectly, or is it a range of factors?
It's a range, but mainly Greenbelt and FRA, but both are slightly erroneous in the fact of they've been assessed slightly differently than other sites would have done. So it's possibly been missed off going to stage 3, for example, by misinterpretation of the actual site.
Thank you. Did the council want to comment on that?
Just briefly, Madam, there is the summary of how the site was assessed appears in the site selection report. It's Appendix B1.5.2. Again, I'm sorry, I haven't got the EB number, but I'm sure somebody can find that whilst I'm speaking. It's site reference SR0020N, and it's on page B786. It's EB 805I. And that confirms that the site did not proceed beyond stage 3 and explains the reason for that. And as we've heard, one of the reasons was because of concerns on flood risk. And essentially the site selection work undertaken on behalf of the council has used the flood risk mapping available through the Environment Agency. I probably not in a position to go into all the detail, but I said that the justification is set out on that page in terms of why the site was discounted.
Okay, anything more on flood risk before we turn to water quality? No? Again, fairly straightforward. I think the most of my questions are obviously seem to be addressed by the statement of common ground and the proposed modifications part B of DM 18. That obviously reflects engagement with Thames Water on the concerns they raised in their Reg 20 representation.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Okay. And my understanding is that if these modifications are made, they no longer object. Correct?
That's correct as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any comments? Mr. Butcher.
Sorry, Mum, not necessarily related to that, but could I just flag up, and it's not related to the questions you've asked and not related to the issues that are raised in the Council's hearing statement, but could I just draw your attention to policy DM 15 and page 101 of the plan. It's a question, it's not necessarily a criticism of the Council, but can I just draw your attention to item IV4 of the policy, which suggests that proposals for new development will be required to include measures to assist existing communities at risk of flooding where feasible. Just a little bit nervous about the precise wording of that policy because it does potentially suggest that there's a requirement for developers to go beyond those measures that are necessary to mitigate flood risk that might be associated with their site. It may be something that perhaps the council might want to comment upon, but it just seemed to me to go just a bit further than perhaps just mitigating the effect of from your development.
They might do, but if they don't want to do that now, we have a session on the DM policies, which that will crop up in the details. So, thank you for flagging that up. Okay, just turning briefly back to the this seems like a very petty point perhaps to raise as there's nothing else. So again, we work on the basis that you work up the list of proposed modifications on the basis of the wording in here. It's missing a couple of either or the in some case, so we have, I think.
Yeah.
So when you do the proper wording, just correct that.
I noticed a couple of minor errors as well.
Very minor point, but save
fine.
someone else pointing it out later on. Thank you. I have no further questions. Does anyone else want to raise anything about flood risk or water quality? No. Thank you. Then thank you all for your contributions. Today's hearing's closed at 3:30. Thank you.